Welcome to Salt of the Earth Farm Stories.
It just felt normal to know how food grows, how is it grown, who's involved, what's involved.
Today, we talk to the incredibly clever Anastasia Volkova, CEO and co-founder of Regrow Ag, recently named one of BBC's top 100 women. Anastasia is a visionary leader helping shape the future of agricultural resilience. With a background in aerospace engineering and a passion for solving some of agriculture's biggest challenges, she has built one of the world's leading agricultural technology companies.
So now Regrow provides this measurement system or this pane of glass transparency into supply chains on more than half of the world's arable land.
Regrow Ag sits at the intersection of agriculture, technology and sustainability. Using satellite imagery, farm data and environmental science, they help farmers and food companies measure the impact of regenerative agriculture, from improving soil health and storing carbon to reducing emissions across the supply chain. What makes Regrow's work so important is measurement.
As a science-based software provider that is effectively this transaction layer that says what you are doing is fair and honest and you should be paid for it fairly and honestly. And that's kind of it.
In a world increasingly focused on sustainability, farmers, supply chains and consumers all want to know what's really working. Regrow is helping provide the data, science and confidence to turn good intentions into measurable outcomes. Get ready for a fascinating conversation as we cross to California to speak with Anastasia Volkova. Hello, Anastasia.
Hi, Darren. Thank you so much for having me.
Really good to meet you. What part of the world have we caught you in today?
California.
And you're coming into your summer?
That's right. We're coming into summer. I have lived here since just before the pandemic, and prior to that, as your listeners might know, I've lived in Australia for a couple of years and wish I could stay, but the global supply chain and capital movements have dragged me over here, so I decided to stay.
Okay. Whereabouts in Australia were you?
In Sydney.
Right. Fantastic. Now, what first sparked your interest in agriculture?
It is interesting to respond to this question, given now that I've worked in this space for over a decade, but originally I wouldn't have said that this is something that's so deeply of interest to me. It's more that it felt very close to home, very natural. Mum always grew things. Godmother had a little farm with research aspects because she was a scientist, and it just felt normal to know how food grows, how is it grown, who's involved, what's involved. I participated, obviously. I planted our seedlings out. We grew vegetables in our garden, and there were a lot of production fields across the road in the southern Ukraine where I grew up. To me, that felt like what people did. And of course, if you are in a city, you don't see that as much, but it just like any Australian, you would have a connection back to the farm. Any Ukrainian has a connection back to the farm. Technically, any American or European does too. But it's not until I was working on my doctorate at Sydney Uni that I was realizing that actually a way for me to contribute to positively impact the planet is to work with farmers and their agronomists with some of the information that was becoming available, trying to help them make better decisions to mimic the way that I saw my family raise food in a way that was very careful, very aware, and on a very small piece of land, of course, compared to the massive commercial farms that you can find in New South Wales or Victoria or in the middle of Ukraine.
And you wanted healthier food and fibre, didn't you? And you wanted more measurement tools, is that right?
Yeah, so actually, what we started with is the support from RDCs, from both the grain and the cotton one, where they said, okay, well, this looks very promising. That what satellite imagery is able to tell us is about the sufficiency of nutrients in the crop or deficiency of the nutrients in the crop. And of course, cotton gets into news regularly with the water use and the fertilizer use. And I think it is a crop that you can grow very responsibly. And of course, it's a premium crop in Australia. And so we started experimenting, flying the drones over the fields together with agronomists, a lot of help from independent agronomists in collecting the plant samples and sending to the lab and checking that everything correlates from the lab to the aerial image from the drone to the satellite image and seeing what could be scaled out of that. And the reason why measurement came to be the focus is because in spending time with agronomists, I've discovered that they're looking after 30, 50,000 hectare properties, and it's impossible to know which paddock to go to on any given morning, and you only have so much time with any particular client that you're working with. Plus, the farmers, of course, themselves are very proactive about managing their land. So if you could have any signal that something might be going wrong in a particular area, wouldn't you want to receive it that day within a window of 2 to 3 days to head out there to see what's going on, maybe turning off irrigation, maybe doing something else. And so these two ideas, they coalesced that to look after very large areas of land, you can actually harness the value of the insights from satellite imagery. But the tool itself is just an aid to the expert, to the agronomists and the farmers on the ground. And the opportunity in the measurement was to see where we needed to direct our attention, because in rural areas there's always a lack of skilled labor, and you can't just disperse your agronomist's time on everything and anything. If they have time to check the paddocks, you ideally want to make sure that they're going to the ones that are vulnerable, to the ones that are needing the most attention, or to the representative ones. And so that's where that idea started to grow.
Interesting. And like when you say we won't go to just one paddock, that some of these paddocks can be large, very large, and you might need different needs for different parts of the paddock. Anastasia, can you tell me about Regrow Ag?
Absolutely. So when you look at that founding story and where we started with, actually, I'll give her a shout out here because she's so incredible, with Brooke Sawyer, who was at the time with an independent retailer, Maury, and a number of other agronomists that helped me get it started and collected the data and driving the utes with them, and then seeing that, hey, actually, this can be a valuable tool. We then moved it further into the supply chain. So we realized that just the value proposition between the agronomist and farmer in terms of optimizing the inputs that were going into the paddock was a starting value proposition, but you could potentially get better deals in the supply chain if you were able to demonstrate that you were growing things in a more ecosystem friendly manner, in a more biodiversity friendly manner, that you were conserving the inputs, whether it was water or nitrogen fertilizer. And so we found traction with vertically integrated food companies that was in specialty crops first, and then it started growing outside of potatoes into the grains as well. And so this is really where the beginning of Regrow started, and that was 6 years ago compared to the business itself started with that idea in Australia 10 years ago. So now Regrow provides this measurement system, or this pane of glass transparency into supply chains on more than half of the world's arable land. And it's powering the payments to farmers to participate in adoption of the practices that suit them the most, where they need the support financially and risk sharing financially to adopt those practices, if they're aligned with both what they're looking for agronomically and what the supply chain downstream from them is looking for in terms of the ecosystem benefits.
This is pretty big.
Yeah, it's pretty significant scale, but it feels like there is still a need to act upon this information. We were just talking with the team about it earlier today, that we've empowered more than $50 million of payments to farmers for what the farmers elected to do. But when you contrast it, less than 10 million hectares of land that are managed in this way that we've touched, and I'm just rounding out that number, versus 1.4 billion acres or half a billion of hectares of land where we have the visibility. There is still a big gap in terms of activating the finance and insurance and maybe additional incentives from the market to help the producers bridge the gap in what they're trying to adopt. So We've definitely started.
Yeah.
I can't
And
tell you we're done.
do you know why that some farmers might just switch off when we hear the words regenerative or carbon?
Yeah, those are great questions, Darren, especially for who I'm hoping we're speaking to as the audience here. So Australian farming community has heard about ACUs, and that's probably the only acronym I will allow myself to use, the carbon units. And it's been a conversation about, okay, well, what are we using to measure it? Are we going to sample the soil? Oh, it seems like we're sitting on this pile of carbon. Oh, how exciting. Maybe we can monetize it. But I think Australia has this pretty isolated kind of national registry, which is fantastic for a national approach, but it hasn't been connected to the global supply chains. And so I'll give two different perspectives. That on one hand, nationally, those are independently registered projects where producers are probably saying, listen, this is what I've been doing, and it's so positive. I should be paying for this ecosystem service. Or in some cases, I'm willing to start doing something that's very positive and I want to be paid for it because this is the national value, the treasure of continuing to steward the land that we live on and to provide food security for not only Aussies but the region and beyond because it's largely export driven market. I'm not saying anything new here. But if you look at the supply chains, they've been actually acting very differently. It hasn't been about just selling carbon. It's really been about the resiliency of the supply chains because look at what's happened in the last 10 years. We first had bumper rains, 2016, 17. Then we had historic droughts with the Red Cross supporting farmers. We're now in a time of pressure and squeeze and unrest again on multiple fronts, and it hasn't been smooth sailing in between those data points. So when we start looking at resilience of supply chains for Australia specifically, we are seeing constant disruption. Every 2 to 3 years, it's an extreme event. And I would say everywhere globally, it's now the case. It's almost every year there is an extreme event, flood, drought, heat stress. If you're a food company that's reliant on sourcing a particular ingredient, like you want to go to the drive-through and get coffee a certain way, get your chips a certain way, that just might not be available if the potatoes are not grown that season, that year from those farmers, if those fields get flooded. So you start thinking about assurance of the supply chain. And this is where we partner with a lot of companies downstream from the farmer, not because we think they're so much better than the farmer, but because we're trying to bring that incentive upstream onto the farm, offer it to the farmers, offer those programs for enrollment to them. And I think this is where maybe the word regenerative, because it came with the frameworks that the companies had to define, as opposed to something that the farmers said, this is what I consider regenerative. Can we actually be ever regenerative? Because regeneration is a process, it's a process of continuous improvement, ongoing improvement. And all of that is in contrast to just selling Australian carbon units, which of course is really beneficial. It's an investment on the land nationally, but looked at more broadly, it's in service of trying to build resiliency for the larger food system that the Australian farming sector supports.
So, how do we make it sound a bit more practical than theoretical?
What we have seen is when the farmer starts tuning out when they hear, oh, it's about regeneration. They could define regeneration, right? Like, I'm doing something to steward my land for you to come and tell me what's regenerative on my land. But maybe that language misses the intention of continuous improvement and better livelihoods and better resilience, which is what it's truly aimed at. And to make it more practical, what we see working well is working with the local advisors, whether it's a technical advisor, whether it's an agronomic advisor, someone who is able to say, I have this group of blokes, they're really very innovative. They've been doing all the things. What can be the incentives for them? And I have this other group of producers that are interested in trying something new. They need a different kind of incentive to start something, to experiment with it, to take on that risk. And I feel like those types of programs are better taken up by the community because they're grounded in the needs of the community. From our perspective, as a science-based software provider that is effectively this transaction layer that says what you are doing is fair and honest, and you should be paid for it fairly and honestly. And that's kind of it, with a lot of sophisticated science that's wrapped around it. That is offered with as much of flexibility as possible. Like, we're not prescribing what practices to use. If you want to experiment with variable rate nitrogen, if you want to experiment with more crops in rotation, because they'll give you soil more nutrients. If you want to experiment with some other new tools or technologies, drip irrigation, what have you, there's probably ways to make that included into the project and participating into it based on what the funders want to achieve too: resilience for the farming community, their inclusion, and the de-risking capital to flow into adoption of better practices. So I think that's what makes it practical, makes it grounded on the land and those practices that the farmer chooses to adopt.
I think a lot of us could do with your help, Anastasia. It's fascinating.
Thank you so much, Darren. And this is why we started and with the team are doing what we're doing, because we believe this information can drive more recognition of the good practices and can also drive attention to areas where things maybe are not working, like even working with governments and seeing where policies, and for those governments that do offer subsidies to farmers, where those could be distributed better aligned with the private sector. It's all part of it, trying to understand how to actually have the food system fit for the future generations.
What do you think our biggest barrier is? Complexity, trust?
Multiple barriers, multiple barriers. It just takes us so long to actually change if you think about it. We've
Yeah.
been doing things a certain way for thousands of years. And when you want to change, you really want everything to line up, the stars to be perfectly aligned for you, meaning that the government policy will be pointed in that direction. The private industry incentives will be pointed in that direction. Maybe the new generation that wants to take over the farm would be interested in it. And there will be paths to be doing that within your community so that your neighbors don't look weird at you, that they have a turned over soil and it's black, and you're actually fiddling with some cover cropping or some, mixes that are new. If the farmers don't get that alignment of signal, they get the disparity of signal, it actually feels risky to adopt something. At least that's what I've seen. And you can adopt it on a small area, but you wouldn't necessarily put your entire operation into something that you weren't entirely certain of was, say, compatible with, like, is the government scheme compatible with my supply chain contracts? Is one better than the other? What should I do? We're seeing some of the alignment be broken now in certain countries around the world, but if you look to Australia, it's still coming into alignment. The government is saying, we're on this path of resiliency and sustainability, but it's also not necessarily backed with huge additional incentives. So usually for the farmers to adopt, it's undertaking the risk. And to de-risk something, you need additional capital that is added to your balance sheet to be able to absorb that shock of it not working out. If you try a new crop, if you try a new practice, what if you don't get your normal operations in because you're starting to try this new practice? So there needs to be a financial mechanism. It doesn't have to be a blank check. It could be a warranty or something that is a true financial instrument that protects you from this risk. But I think it's this whole stack of solutions that are still coming together because it's relatively new. And having worked on it for 10 years, I wish I could tell you, oh my gosh, this is so straightforward. Just jump on board. I think for different farmers, it's different. I would say, by and large, it's the capital that's blocking it. But then when you look a little bit more closely where the capital is available, maybe it's the technical assistance that, if it was there, you would have more adopters.
Because there's a lot of pressure on farmers, isn't there, with demanding insurance costs and regulations and so forth. And we can't change the whole farm all at once.
Absolutely. That would not be good business. That would be too much too soon. You do want to adopt it gradually, just like you don't change the entire business process, whatever is the business that you run, like your small business, my small business, listeners' small business. You don't change it all at once, even if you think it's the best idea ever. You try it, you see if it's working, you try to scale it to see if the scaling of it is working, and then when it's producing results, you are deciding to convert. And maybe those for the farm practice adoption look like different incentives. Maybe the private company that has a supply chain contract provides the initial incentive, but then additional incentives maybe can come out from the operational P&L of the farm. Actually, let's experiment with using less fertilizer here. Let's lean more on the rotation here. Or let's lean on some new practices and see if that can drive us better margins. Maybe that's what that next chapter of adoption looks like, given that we can't necessarily rely on government to provide us with incentives to transition around the regenerative practices or soil conservation practices.
And I think we all want to have less imports and because of the rising costs as well.
Absolutely. Those are pretty alarming, aren't they? And
Mm.
in the year where the yields are high and the input costs are low, the adoption of technologies around efficiencies and optimization is very low, and every agronomist knows that that's a cycle, because now we're in that part of the cycle when the commodity prices aren't really high, but the input costs are extremely high. And so you're starting to really shift the mentality of like, where else can be the incentives in the supply chain where I'm operating? Can I supply something maybe directly to market if I'm a small operation? If I'm a big broadacre operation, do I want to enroll into a project that enables us to provide our grain, whether it's barley or wheat or other grains, as more regenerative input to companies that care about their supply chains and want to invest in them and protect them? With it, potentially to lower the input costs over time. But that's something not everyone's mind in a year like this, with the disruption we're all living through.
Yeah. And Anastasia, do we underestimate the importance of measurement?
I think that is the easiest question for me to say yes to, because when it's available, we take it for granted. We weigh our cattle, we measure how our children grow, we look at, I don't know, our blood test results, and yet for us to really start understanding that the planet is so vast and we terraformed it so much that we do not have a good grasp anymore as to what is the impact of that terraforming. And when we think about huge floods or droughts, we are losing a lot of topsoil, we are losing a lot of nutrition, and it is going into ecosystems that don't need that nutrient profile. And we're all very, very aware of it. But when you start putting the numbers to it, it can be surprising. So I think we are underestimating the importance of measurement. I do think long term, it's not just a prerogative of the companies caring about their supply chains to get access to that type of measurement, but it is really something that governments should take on a lot more seriously, because right now we're talking about nationalization of supply chains, local supply chains, seasonal produce. I think it'll continue to be the trend. That doesn't mean the globalization trend is over, but it is an additional trend as well. And looking at that information, like one of your previous guests, look at the biodiversity. It's the same way. Like, we're not listening in this case to the chirping of the planet, but we're watching it. We're watching its heartbeat in both the places where it's managed by human and where it's not. And we need to be honest about, are we managing it, stewarding it responsibly, or do we need to change something?
Thank you. Sometimes we might think it's too much data across one property, but this is where you guys can come in and help, isn't it?
Yes, and I feel like it's such a misnomer that there can be too much data. I mean, each of us can get to a point where it's too much data, right? Like, we have AI tools at our fingertips now. We can search for any information, and within minutes we will have it. On farm, you have so many data points as well, just an abundance. But if you're not making decisions with that, can you really say that that's data that's useful to you? And ultimately, the way that we come with our solution proposition to the community is to say, we're actually trying to ask you the least amount of information possible. And if you choose to add additional ones, you will improve the estimates of the models. That will improve your payouts. But realistically, you are being paid for your good stewardship that you can prove with the data. And that's where the value of data is actually important. I've been saying this for at least 5 years, that to monetize the data for Australian farmers, you actually need a use case to demonstrate what are you monetizing. And that's what I've tried to center the last, 6 years of Regrow around creating that path for the incentives downstream to flow back to the farm, because then you can say I'm monetizing my data. If you're just looking at this piles of data and different tests, they might not be tied to a use case that anyone is willing to pay you for in the supply chain. And in that case, that's just data. But is it useful
Mm.
data? Is it something that can earn you money? Is it something that can help you tell the story so you can get a premium? Not always.
And are you using tools like satellites, AI, and high tech stuff, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. So, when I was doing my doctorate at Sydney Uni, the satellites that have cameras that are particularly good for seeing crop health just came online. There were European satellites. I'm European born, and to me, it was such an opportunity to start looking at that data over Australian landscape and start ground truthing it. Then the team at Regrow has developed some of the cutting edge generative AI models at the time, and we weren't, making a big hoopla about it because it's just the tooling that we need to translate myriads of pixels that are describing every particular place on the farm into a conversation that says, "Oh, we're growing tomatoes over here, we're growing barley over here, and we know that these fields reach this particular quality requirements that were needed downstream. Whilst actually, this field of wheat that maybe is a trial of a new variety is not performing as expected." And so we started there, combining satellite imagery with AI for interpretation, and then we understood that that was just a mirror back to the practices that were visible. There was also so much that we couldn't see from the satellite imagery. And farmers could tell us this is how much input I've actually applied at the beginning of the season or in the first few months of the season. And then we would be able to put that through a crop and soil model to say, and now what? And this is what you can get. This is how you can consider management decision changes. This is how you can show that you're improving year on year. And that's where the technology fits. It's not necessarily, a hammer in the search of a nail. I don't think any business can survive for 10 years being a hammer in the search of a nail. But we have found certain use cases where we can drive visibility into supply chain for companies that are willing to invest in what matters to them and for the farmers to participate in it monetarily as well. And the fact that tech is involved, it just helps us scale. And it's not that scale is important for an individual farmer, but if you think about it, if you are part of a larger project, it actually is the case that scientifically and statistically you will get better outcomes because you're not an outlier, you're not alone. You're able to be put into the context of everybody else, how they farm, and that's how you're able to get the incentives. So
Mm.
scale in some cases actually is a path to efficient deployment of resources and real financial motivations.
And would the satellites be looking at the color, density, and working out what sort of plant it is and telling you?
It's a little bit more nuanced than that. So if you've ever looked through the different color glasses, this could be a good analogy. Or if you've gone to the movies and you've had this red and blue glasses that could help you see in 2D or 3D, it's more like that. It's invisible to a human eye that the plant is actually radiating in infrared and in different spectra of infrared. It's almost as it's trying to talk to us. It's trying to kind of release that energy that it's not able to use. So we're providing it with the energy, we're providing it with nutrients, but there's something blocking it from growing out of that energy, from using it really well. So if you're able to see that in this near infrared spectrum, you're then knowing where you should pay your attention. So that's on, it's a little bit beyond the color spectrum. Of course, you can see the greens and the reds, and they're helpful in broad determination of the land management type that is there, the evergreens, of course, or the eucalyptus forest. You'll be able to see them on an annually cropped broadacre farm. You would be looking for the crop health in these more nuanced infrared spectra from these sophisticated satellite cameras. And to us, they just come as colored images. We just can't see them like that with a
Mm.
human eye, but we can draw that image from the scientific sensor in orbit and then go and apply it in real life, walk into that area, see what's going on, and maybe see the first signs.
And this is fascinating. Like at the end of the day, you're looking at the soil health, aren't you, from the sky?
We're looking at plant health and soil health. And so the connection is as follows. if you're able to see what happens to every crop that grows in rotation on that piece of land, if then you're able to see the residue, because the paddock that looks fully cultivated looks very different from the paddock that is direct drilled into and direct seeded into. They just look very different. And so you can infer that if you know this was the weed crop and afterwards there was this much residue left, this was the cultivation method. If you're able to see any additional crops in the off season, you know that that helps to feed the topsoil microbes and that enables to support greater biodiversity in the soil. You're actually then piecing the puzzle together like a bit of a Sherlock Holmes picture where you collected all these cues and then you put them into a simulator and you say, can you tell me if this farm's soil is improving in terms of its health, was actually decaying, or what would change it from one to the other? So we're not trying to sense what is happening in the top layer of the soil, although with the radar satellites you can see the topsoil moisture. That is, that can be used, but this is not what we're looking at. We're looking at how's the farm managed for the above ground? Is it overall a nourishing, replenishing, sequestering process or an extractive process? Because we know some crops are way hungrier than others and they need to be constantly fed additional inputs. And so if you have a sustainable rotation, if you're cultivating the land in a sustainable way, then probably the model says, hey, I think this soil sequesters nitrogen. I think it has a very good structure. Look, this last time it was flooded, it was infiltrated really well. The crop was established really well compared to this neighboring property that is managed differently. And the flood waters you could see really did not stay on the property. They left, they were washed off. So all of these pieces together, you are starting to tell the story of the paddock from the impact perspective rather than directly sensing it, if that makes sense.
Mm. And what would a successful regenerative farm look like in 10 years? Say we start making some changes today.
You have seen in the most, on the first glance, desolate of landscapes, the ability to regenerate them truly. I will go far away from the developed world. Like if you looked at Africa and the half moon dugouts that keep the water, then become these cradles of new growth of plants, you're able to see local communities stop the advancement of the sub-Saharan desert. That is just so incredible that you can do that literally in the continent that has a desert that's encroaching on production areas. That gives me so much faith that you can do that in Australia, and certain people are already doing it in Australia. So to me, what does it look like? It looks like a place with water security. As someone from the south speaking to Australians, it looks like a place with a lot of water security. And with that water security, you start seeing the biodiversity that's dependent on that plant diversity that in the first place is able to improve the soil health, to capture the rainfalls, to have the soil water holding capacity to last the seasons that are inevitably dry at some points and incredibly wet some other times. I think that's what regenerative farm of the future looks like. And for us to come to that farm and maybe taste a product from it, even if it's actually grain, maybe it's a beer in a barley, maybe it's a regenerative grain for flour in the bread. I do think that in 10 years from now, we have very strong correlations between regenerative practices, soil health, and nutrition, human nutrition, not just the macros. There's new research by innovators like Audacious that are showing that there is more of certain types of vitamins, more of certain types of fibers in crops grown regeneratively. I hope that in 10 years it's such an explosive success that we're just able to tell that nutritionally those products are really better for the soil and better for human health. And with that alignment, I think we will drive the transition.
Thank you. Are farmers often expected to help solve climate changes?
I believe so. I think it's a very easy narrative to fall into. Generally, the statistic is clear that agriculture is impacting climate and climate is impacting agriculture, and then this vicious cycle. If you look at some of the statistics and data, you can see that between 10 up to 30% of different countries' contribution in greenhouse gas emissions have accounted on that basis are coming from agriculture. And that, of course, means that agriculture has room to become more climate friendly. But realistically, we also know that soils can still sequester more carbon in many areas where it's still possible to continue in reaching the sequestration rates. What you could expect in those cases is for agriculture to be net positive to climate. And it's, if not the only industry where it's possible, you're not able to look at the steel makers or automakers or airplane makers and say, please become net positive on your own, because you can. And I think that's why farmers are often engaged in this discussion, because as stewards of the land, their decisions, their courage, their abilities to innovate and find partners and in many cases take on risks can improve the sequestration and soil health from their operations to a point where it's positive. And I know the Australian farmers have done so much of it, given it was a necessity. In many other countries around the world, even the basic conservation practices have not been as widespread because it hasn't been a necessity. But I think the farmers carry a lot on their shoulders. It's feeding
Mm.
us, it's solving our climate change problem. But really, it's just like looking to the consumer to solve climate change problem. It's not the right framing. It's a systematic problem where we're each of us are a part of it, and we need to find the right role for ourselves to play within our communities. It's not an individual role for anyone to fix, any consumer or any farmer.
Is there one conversation you wish would happen a bit more around the kitchen table?
I wish it was a conversation about how can those providers of capital, of inputs, of advice that come to the farm, how are they contributing to its long-term resilience? Because I think it's always prudent of us to think about the short term and medium term, because farming business is like any business, it needs to survive the next season, survive the next fiscal year, financial year. But I wish we were a little bit more focused on what it means to drive profitability on that individual farm, to be higher, to drive the risk in maybe with some partnerships, to bring capital providers that are willing to either lend capital or for other incentives in order to future-proof that land a little bit more.
I could talk to you for hours, Anastasia. This is fascinating. But we're up to some off the wall questions. These are a little bit quirky. They're short answers and a little bit fun. What's the most unexpected thing a farmer has taught you?
They just taught me about life. I think that's very unexpected. You can just learn about everything in life if you stay on the farm.
Yeah. What's your favorite piece of old school farming wisdom?
I don't know if it's formulated the same way in Australia, but my family, especially the one that farmed, the old school wisdom was a version of this too shall pass, or what goes around comes around. Like the fact that life is a spiral, and you might be finding out yourself in a similar place multiple times, but in a from a different perspective, so to speak. And I think the natural cycles are such a clear example of that.
Anastasia, if you could magically fix one thing in agriculture overnight, what would it be?
Oh, I would put price on natural resources everywhere all at once. Done.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Thank you. What's the most exciting thing happening in agriculture that people aren't talking enough about?
I believe it's the connection between regenerative practices, soil health, and nutrition. I think it needs to be talked about a lot more. I think it's an extremely exciting new development.
If you sat down with a young farmer today, what advice would you give them?
I would tell them that they have agency beyond what they can currently perceive, because the supply chain is really turning to listen to the farm, to the first mile, and I think they can get their voice in almost any room in any supply chain. This is where the farmers are welcome. Everyone wants to know that it's working for the farm because everyone depends on the farm.
And Anastasia, one question I ask everybody at the end, and you've seen a lot of different parts of the world. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
This is not an easy question because I immediately run a multi-parameter climate optimization. So I have to say somewhere a little bit further north from the equator just to be
Right.
safe.
Put you in an awkward position, haven't I?
Exactly.
If we want to know more about Regrow Ag, where do we go? Is there a website?
Absolutely. There is a website where the team posts the wisdom and insights from the communities and the data of regrow.ag, like agriculture. And we also are very active on LinkedIn, also posting our insights and opportunities, whether they are career opportunities for people in our network or there are opportunities to join projects for farming communities.
And you've got quite a large team there. If we want to get in touch, there'll be someone to reach out to.
Absolutely. You can reach out to, like, literally our LinkedIn. You can reach out to hello@regrow.ag and we will route your inquiry because it might be something that um community of working on marketing is better suited, or a team that's working on science is better suited to. So just reach out to us. And of course you can hit my email directly. It's Anastasia@regrow.ag.
Fantastic. And I want to quickly shout out to Eleni, who's helped set this up. Thank you, Eleni. Well, that wraps up this episode. Anastasia, I've loved chatting to you and learning about Regrow Ag. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you so much for just shining the spotlight on this incredible community in Australian land stewardship. And I could not agree more with the name of the podcast that you have. They are the salt of the earth, and they're just incredible people. And I'm it's a privilege to be serving them and other farmers around the world.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Darren.
Thanks for listening. For more information on Regrow Ag, head to regrow.ag. A big thank you to Anastasia Volkova for joining us and sharing her insights. It's been a fascinating look into how data, science, and technology are reshaping the way we understand and measure agriculture at scale. Please subscribe to Salt of the Earth Farm Stories and follow us on social media. And remember, keep your hands dirty and your spirits high.